Hey, thank you. It's great to be here. And it's Bieber, just like my cousin Justin Bieber. But yeah, it's great to be with you all. Hopefully you can see our slides. I don't know, Rachna, if you do you want to introduce yourself first and then I can go?
Sure. I'm Rachna Ananthakrishnan, and that was a very good pronunciation of my last name. I'm with the University of Chicago, and I'm the executive director of the Globus department at the university. I'm also here in my capacity as a member of the CTAB board in InCommon, but we're going to talk about that some more, so I'm going to leave it at that.
Thanks, Rachna. So for those of you that don't know me, my name is Brett Bieber, and I'm the Director of Security Engineering at the University of Nebraska. And I also am going to be speaking here from my participation with InCommon and the Community Trust and Assurance Board, and drawing on a little bit of my experience as operating an identity provider within the InCommon Federation. In fact, the team that I lead runs 5 identity providers across the University of Nebraska system and the state colleges within the state of Nebraska. So I was very excited to hear a number of folks mention, starting with Rob early this morning about security as an enabler, and then a number of other folks talking about how federated identity is being used and is being leveraged, and a number of folks also mentioning how we can enhance the security of our research projects through the use of federated authentication. Brian Bockelman mentioned specifically REFEDS and multi-factor and also assurance, and Jim Basney mentioned that it was a great lead-in question to our presentation here this afternoon, where we're going to be talking a little bit more about this. So anyways, it's been fantastic to kind of listen throughout the day and hear some folks mention specifically some of the things we're going to be talking about. But why don't we jump in here, and I'll apologize if some of you may have seen some of these slides before. Tom Barton, who's a colleague of ours and have worked with him for a number of years within InCommon and also back to his work with the University of Chicago. He gave a presentation at PERC earlier this summer in July, where he talked a lot about some of the work we've been doing with the National Institutes of Health. So I apologize, but repetition is the key to learning. So if you've seen this before, we're going to be talking a little bit more about this and also giving you an update on our current status. So this diagram here talks about, tries to explain and convey to you what we have within the research and education sector across the globe. And we're going to be talking about all of these identities that you can leverage within your research collaborations, and how you use the identities that are out there, and how you can increase the security by leveraging these federated identities, that you don't have to actually create contracts yourself with every single one of these external parties. You can leverage these federations to do some of that work for you. So if you're not familiar, within the United States, we have InCommon. InCommon is our national operator for our education federation. And I have some stats up here. I just updated those. I grabbed those yesterday. And the slide that I took this from was actually from a presentation that I did with Tom and Kevin Maroney about 2 or 3 years ago. And I was kind of excited to see that EduGain, which is the global federation organization, they've increased by 7%. So, I mean, I've seen a number of identity providers and service providers grow in this space over the last few years. I'm just now finishing up my 6th year with InCommon on their Community Trust and Assurance Board. But we've seen a number of more service providers, more identity providers, more countries begin joining EduGain. And so there's a lot of expertise in how we're building this, and a lot of collaboration, which I think is one of the foundational elements that I've been really excited to see and participate in, that Rachna and I are going to be talking about this at the end, is the collaboration aspect of this and how you all can get involved. So suffice to say, EduGain is our global federation, and through that, researchers can use their home institution credentials to access your research collaboration infrastructure, log in using their home credentials, and not have to get a new username and password. They can leverage even multi-factor and additional aspects that increase the security of your research projects. I'm also going to be drawing on a little bit of information that came out of what we like to call FIM4R, Federated Identity Management for Research. And this is referencing FIM4R version 2, which was published in July 2018. A number of these research and scholarly communities all got together to collaborate, discuss how they're using federated identities, what do they need out of federated identities, and published a paper talking about who would be responsible for coming up with those solutions, whether something new needed to be developed, whether something existing could take and advance that forward. So a lot of great information that we'll be talking about today came out of these research and scholarly communities coming together and identifying what did they need? Where were the gaps between what federated identity could offer, and where can we fill those gaps? If you've seen this pyramid before, it tries to explain how we are increasing the security of this federation. What I'm talking about here. And if we start at the bottom of this pyramid, we have all of these features that support just basic collaboration between a researcher at one institution and another researcher at another institution. And there's a number of items in there specifically. Accurate metadata, which is some of the technical bits around what those identity providers and service providers are. Error handling, some basic security, support for what we call the research and scholarship services, research and scholarship entity category, in case you've heard of that. And then on top of that, we have more advanced features that can increase the security of the federated identities that you're using. And as we go up this pyramid, all of these features build on top of themselves to create a more secure environment. And by using the federation and having the federation deliver a lot of these things and build out all of the security, you are avoiding having to sign contracts with every single one of these participating organizations. So at the bottom here, it's mentioning, if you were doing this in a traditional business-to-business model, you would have to create a contract and have a contract signed between every single one of these entities. The federation is what can deliver some of these pieces. And Rachna and I will be talking about how the federations are currently delivering those and increasing the security of the federation. So I want to introduce a little bit here of a program that we call within InCommon Baseline Expectations. Baseline Expectations was created out of the Community Trust and Assurance Board that Rachna and I are both on. I was there. This is my 6th year. I'm finishing up my 6th year working on CTAB, and we started to develop and identify the need for every single member of the Federation to meet some of those base items of the pyramid. So we started this, and it's actually built into the participation agreement with InCommon. So every member of InCommon, they sign that participation agreement, which legally binds them to that they're required to meet baseline expectations. So that's the foundation there. If we have a participant that doesn't meet these requirements, we have the teeth to actually remove them from the Federation if necessary. We also have this sustaining engine for change and continuing to evolve what we call baseline expectations. So as I mentioned, CTAB, the Community Trust and Assurance Board, is that organization, and it is comprised of members within the community. So I'm an identity provider. Rachna is from a major service provider and from the University of Chicago. We have other peers from commercial service providers in there, other research projects, other identity provider operators, a number of different folks all working together to identify what are these standards, these baseline expectations that we're going to require from every member of the Federation. And we work together to both define these standards, facilitate a community consensus process. So when we want to develop a new requirements, we're publishing those out and getting feedback from the community. And then we also have a formalized process for handling disputes. If one participant has an objection to how another participant operates, we have a formal process for reviewing that and taking action on it. So all of this structure has been built up over a number of years so that we can make sure that the security of these federated identities is upheld at some base requirement. And we have this sustained engine for change and advancing that, the requirements, and we're continuing to evolve and move those higher and higher so that we can increase the value of the Federation to you. So I mentioned baseline expectations. We've finished what we called version 1. That was the first one that started a few years ago, and we actually wrapped that up. And that was some of the basic, making sure our metadata was clean and we had accurate contact information, all of those sort of things that were very important and foundational that we could build on top of. Now we're currently working to finalize baseline version 2. And Rachna and I will show you kind of where we're at in that process. But that is enhancing some of those security pieces by requiring every member of the InCommon Federation to attest that they meet Certify, which is the Security Incident Response Trust Framework for Federated Identity. And it's a basic process of that if there is a security incident with one of the identities that you either are a service provider and that identity accessed your service, or there was a security incident, that there's enough information, enough process behind all of that that you could trace and you could examine that incident and work together to remediate whatever that incident was. We're also requiring some basic security requirements, such as meeting SSL labs and a grade of A or higher, any A, I guess, any A plus, A or A minus, so that we can eliminate some of the man in the middle or other vulnerable attacks from some of those lower TLS ciphers. So we're requiring that. And then also ensuring that every one of those identity providers also publishes an error page, just in case there's something wrong, that your users don't get dead-ended. You know, they have a place to go. They have an error URL that you can present to them so that they can get to a place where they can help. So that's where we're at with baseline version 1 and version 2. And now there's a number of other things that we can build on top of this to enhance the security. And I'm going to talk a little bit more about how InCommon has been partnering with the National Institutes of Health to bring this enhanced level of security to some specific research collaborations or research services that are provided by the National Institutes of Health. So in particular, I want to talk to you about the REFEDS MFA profile. If you're not familiar with REFEDS, it's the Research and Education Federation Operators. It's a group of all of the national federations that I had mentioned before in the earlier slide. InCommon is the one in the United States. And the other thing, just to highlight how sustained we have been at trying to build these, the MFA profile that is REFEDS MFA profile actually started with InCommon in the Assurance Advisory Committee with Karen Harrington and a number of other folks who actually developed that. And we developed it within the United States, which was great. But we realized that in order to support all of the collaboration that we do, we needed something that was international. And so we handed that standard over to REFEDS so that they could make sure that it was something that could be attested to or could be supported by all of the federations, not just the United States. So we've been working with the NIH to make sure that we're communicating about what REFEDS MFA means and that we have some services that can actually provide that. So to summarize what this actually means is the service can request that multi-factor authentication be performed via some technical means. And then the single sign-on service that is authenticating that user performs that and then relays whether or not that was performed back to the service provider. A key thing here is that without REFEDS and the MFA standard here that we have, there's no real standard way of that occurring. If you have a multi-factor with this service provider, such as a Google identity or some other service provider, there really hasn't been a standard way of communicating whether or not multi-factor has been performed. So that's why REFEDS MFA is so powerful, and these international federations, is that we have the ability to not only request multi-factor, but also attest to and let the service provider know whether or not for that individual user multi-factor was performed. So a lot of power in that, and we'll talk a little bit more about where we're at with the rollout and a number of institutions that are meeting that for the NIH. I guess one last thing there is that with this enhanced interest and the NIH their interest in requiring multi-factor for their researchers accessing the RAS service and those services that are protected by it, we recognized that there was a need to get more information out to the community. So there is a FAQ that has been published with a lot of information, guidance for identity provider operators, service providers, a lot of information there. So I'd encourage you, if you're interested in reading more about what that means, feel free to take a look at the FAQ there that's in the link. I also want to talk a little bit about the identity assurance, which was mentioned earlier. And identity assurance is a way for us to identify, to attest whether or not the person is who they claim they are, if that makes sense. So REFEDS also has an assurance framework, which has been published out there. It's a version 1 right now. And the NIH is also interested in the identity assurance aspect of this as well. So I'll talk a little bit about what this means and give you some more pointers for more information if you're interested in going really in depth to this. And I'll also mention that Kyle Lewis is doing a session tomorrow where he's going to do a little bit more of a deep dive into the assurance framework work that he's been doing with NIAID and the NIH. But for those of us, I'll keep this at a high level. What we're talking about with identity assurance is making sure that the person who presented themselves to your institution or to the identity provider provided some sort of government issued photo ID, and your institution validated that person is correct with the information that you have, and that the network credential that was assigned to them is bound to that user, and that chain of custody between the researcher who presented their identity documents is that same person that holds that network credential between all of that life cycle, when they were hired, for example, all the way through when they needed to access that service provided by the NIH or provided by anyone else. There's a number of different systems here that are probably in place at many institutions across the globe. You have a card office, for example, where you might be issuing your campus ID card, and they may proof identities and verify a government issued ID there. So you may already, many institutions may already have evidence inside their systems of record that this was performed. So there's a number of existing processes that you might be able to leverage in order to support the REFEDS assurance framework. But then getting that information exposed to your identity systems, knowing who to include and what level of confidence you have that the person is who they say they are, it can vary. One of the pieces that I wanted to highlight here is that we're doing this already. Many institutions are already doing this, and you trust those identities enough to access your own internal critical systems, such as for me, logging into our payroll system and directing where my paycheck gets deposited. That would be what we would call local enterprise. And there is a lot of value in us saying that even though I've not met a universal measuring stick for how identities should be proved, we've considered the risk and we're already operating under this process. So local enterprise is a very valuable claim level within the REFEDS assurance framework. And I just want to highlight that as one easy stepping stone to get us to where we want to go. That can be very useful within our own sector, knowing that many research institutions probably handle a lot of these things in the same way and are accepting the same amount of risk there for their local critical systems. So that's an example of local enterprise, and here's the concepts between how we actually convey this information between all of these systems and make sure that the credential was bound to that user when they were proofed. I'll show this slide, not because I want to dig into detail. I think Kyle Lewis is going to talk a little bit more about this tomorrow. And Kyle is actually the author of this. He participated along with a number of others on the Assured Access Working Group, where we developed guidance for institutions that are trying to build out these REFEDS assurance framework within their own communities. But I will share that some of the information that we've built and we have published on this guidance helps clarify if you're being asked to meet a specific NIST identity framework level, so NIST 863.3, how does that align with this international standard that Brett's talking about here, REFEDS assurance framework? This document and the additional documentation that we have within that guidance doc goes through and explains a lot about that and where your existing processes on a identity provider or a campus can potentially meet with those levels. So just to summarize kind of some of the information, we've got a full document that has 27 pages worth of guidance on how to implement these assurance frameworks. If you're interested in leveraging them, I'd recommend you take a look at that. This is the guidance that we're giving to identity providers across the United States. Is our recommended order of implementation is go for local enterprise, then go for low, medium, and high. And if you're trying to implement these for the National Institutes of Health who are interested in the REFEDS assurance framework, begin following some of this guidance here so that you can assert some of those claims. So all of that, a lot of background around how we're increasing and how you can increase the security of federated identity. And now I think I'm going to hand it over to Rachna to talk about, where are we now, where do we go next, and the community involvement.
Thanks, Brett. So I'm going to take the next 5 minutes here to touch on these topics. Next slide, Brett. Thank you. So the first one here I'm going to touch on is just adoption of the baseline expectation. So just as a reminder, Brett talked about the work InCommon is doing to ensure that all the entities are meeting some baseline security requirements. And this is the second version of that. We did the first one and the second one. So you can see from this, we are at about 80%, little over 80% for all entities within InCommon meeting this. We continue to do outreach. At some point, it becomes more targeted outreach. We work more closely with the specific people who need to move to meet the baseline expectations and what may be barriers there and help them over the line, right? So we hit BE1 and we are pretty close to hitting baseline expectations 2. That just makes the whole federation more secure. The second chart we have here is talking about getting ready for NIH. So in September, NIH started requiring 2 things. One was the MFA that Brett mentioned, and then the assurance level, right? So they're requiring that if you are accessing a set of NIH resources, that your identity, your authentication essentially have an MFA and also convey this additional assurance requirement. This tool is not InCommon sort of testing everybody, but this is more people voluntarily testing whether their IDPs are ready for meeting this requirement by NIH. So you can see there's a lot more who are meeting the MFA and it's slowly growing. And we also have about 54 participants who are providing the assurance information to a service provider like NIH, right? So the carrot or the stick here from NIH only applies to about 250 of the InCommon participants, right? So this is specifically motivated by what NIH is asking. So you can, the larger pie of InCommon participants, not all of them may need to meet this. But on the other hand, we're also seeing other grant agencies starting to move towards requiring at least use of federated identities and the infrastructure. We saw that with the CC Star grants. So we are hoping with this big initiative by a big provider like NIH, we're going to see a broader adoption of these standards and overall the Federation moving towards being able to provide more authentication context to the service providers. So next one, so those are current status. Where are we on baseline? Where are we with NIH? This one talks about where are we going? Like Brett said, this is an ongoing endeavor, and InCommon and has set up CTAB and has a whole process for how we continue to evolve the security baseline and the security of the Federation. So you already started discussing baseline expectations 3, what should be required there, what sorts of things should the IDPs and SPs comply with. Everything you heard about today are candidates, absolutely. And most importantly here, even asking that all the identity providers and service providers signal the MFA and the assurance levels, right? So it's not that you meet a specific level, it's at least telling us what you're doing is a good start. So we can start, so that the consuming applications can make smart decisions, right? Do they need to prompt for the second factor, or do they need additional authorization? So at least the signaling is something that we are considering. And research and scholarship is another set of entities that is widely used in the research enterprise, and something that InCommon has been working for a number of years to drive adoption. So these are all candidates. CTAB certainly does not unilaterally decide this. There is a huge engagement process where we meet with a lot of people, get input. There is a community consensus process for making, getting all the input and discussions before a decision is made. So the pitch here I'll make early is to please do engage. There are lots of ways to do that, and I will talk about that. But hearing from the community on what your requirements are and what you need in terms of where the Federation needs to be for you to leverage it and use it in your applications and your research work is critical. So engage and let us know so we can take all that input into consideration. So now on the last slide here is to talk about the community involvement. So InCommon has set up a number of ways by which you can engage. It's one of the most welcoming communities. So there are these community consultations you can certainly be a part of. REFEDS has its own as well. There is a really nice presentation about ways and means of getting engaged with this community, providing your input or even helping make some decisions here. And we have an open call for people joining us at the Community Trust and Assurance Board. I will be finishing my 3rd year on that board. It's a great group of people, and like Brett said, very diverse community. So we're looking for all different perspectives. If you're a research operator, facilitator, you're welcome to come in and provide your input. And I think we have a last slide. It's just a quick summary slide. If you are a service provider, and just for that, anybody who's writing an application serving the research community, whether you're writing thin portals like for data distribution, like Eli talked about, all of you are service providers. You could be using the federated infrastructure and asking for whatever attributes you need there. And then from an identity provider perspective, just even implementing the signaling so that the service providers can leverage and do what they need in terms of security would be a big step up. And for everyone, if you're not in either of those categories, if you're a part of this research enterprise, confirm your institution is meeting baseline. It helps keep the whole Federation secure, and please do get involved. Okay, we have 3 minutes for questions.
And you have 2 questions submitted.
Okay.
The first is from Deb McCaffrey, who wants to know, how can I tell if my institution has tested against the NIH requirements?
That's a good question, Deb. The test tool that the NIH has published is actually available to anyone that has a credential at that institution. So I would go to the NIH's test tool and log in yourself. Choose your institution from the list of all available within InCommon and I think indeed Edugain, and log in and then see from the results there whether or not you meet. In the guidance document that we have for the REFEDS Assurance Framework, and I forgot to mention, Rick Wagner, trusted CI fellow, helped us on the Assured Access Working Group. So thank you, Rick. In that guidance document, we actually show a screenshot of what it should look like if your institution meets those requirements, and information about the attributes that are released.
Thank you so much. Our next question is from Douglas Latman. Will InCommon work with the NIST 863 and IAL2?
Yeah, so what I'll say there, I'll clarify that REFEDS Assurance Framework is not out of InCommon. It's the global federation standard that we're implementing. So InCommon is obviously pushing these standards, and with NIH's help has been rolling this out to a number of institutions. So I mean, we're really excited about it, but it's not InCommon's assurance framework. It's the REFEDS Assurance Framework. What I think I'll let Kyle talk a little bit more in depth tomorrow around that. But last week at the InCommon camp conference, Jeff Erickson with the NIH actually spoke a little bit about this, and he actually showed a diagram around what they're kind of currently thinking within the NIH as to where the REFEDS Assurance Framework version 1 meets, and we do believe that high meets up with that level 2.
Thank you so much.